The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hartwell ranch as 16-year-old Clara May stepped carefully around the mud puddles in the pig pen, her bare feet already caked with filth before the day had truly begun. The smell of manure and rotting slop clung to her threadbare dress, the same dress she'd worn for 3 weeks straight, the same dress that served as her only blanket during the cold Nebraska nights. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara May. The sharp voice of her stepfather, Jeremiah Hartwell, cut through the morning air like a whip crack. Them pigs better be fed and watered before I finish my coffee, or you'll be going without supper again. She moved quickly, her small hands trembling as she hauled the heavy bucket of kitchen scraps toward the feeding trough. The largest boar, a massive creature named Brutus, snorted aggressively and knocked her sideways as he rushed toward the food. Clara May stumbled, falling hard into the mud, but she didn't cry out. She'd learned long ago that showing pain only made things worse. The Hartwell Ranch sat on the outskirts of Millfield, Nebraska, a town barely large enough to warrant a name on any map. Jeremiah had married Clara May's mother, Dorothy, 3 years earlier, just 6 months after Clara May's father had died in a farming accident. What had seemed like salvation for a widow and her young daughter had quickly turned into something far more sinister. Dorothy Hartwell stood at the kitchen window, her once bright eyes now dull and hollow as she watched her daughter struggle with the morning chores. She pressed her fingertips against the glass, leaving small smudges that she'd scrub away later. The woman who had once sung lullabies and braided flowers in Clara May's hair now barely spoke above a whisper, her spirit broken by 3 years of Jeremiah's increasingly cruel treatment of them both. "She's lazy, that girl," Jeremiah muttered as he sat at the kitchen table, his thick fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. "Good for nothing but feeding pigs. At least the pigs serve a purpose. They'll bring money to the market." "Can't say the same for her." Dorothy flinched at his words, but said nothing. She'd learned that defending Clara May only made Jeremiah's anger burn hotter, and the consequences were always worse for her daughter. The purple bruise on Dorothy's left cheek, barely hidden by powder, served as a reminder of what happened. When she spoke out of turn, outside, Clara May finished her morning routine and made her way toward the small shed that had become her sleeping quarters 6 months earlier. Jeremiah had decided that she was taking up too much space in the main house and relegated her to what had once been a storage building. The shed was barely 8 feet by 6 feet, with gaps in the wooden walls that let in wind, rain, and snow. Her bed consisted of a thin layer of hay covered by a single moth-eaten blanket that had belonged to Jeremiah's deceased first wife. The shed sat directly adjacent to the pig pen, separated only by a low wooden fence that the pigs often knocked loose. On cold nights, Clara May could hear them grunting and snuffling just inches from where she tried to sleep. Sometimes, when Jeremiah had been drinking heavily, he would unlock the gate between the shed and the pen, claiming it was an accident, but always with a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Animals belong with animals," he'd say with a laugh that held no warmth. As Clara May gathered eggs from the chicken coop, she caught sight of riders approaching in the distance. 3 men on horseback moved steadily toward the ranch, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky. She paused in her work, shielding her eyes from the sun to get a better look. Visitors were rare at the Hartwell Ranch. Most decent folk in Millfield had learned to avoid Jeremiah and his violent temper. The lead rider sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders and confident posture marking him as someone accustomed to command. Even from a distance, Clara May could see the way he carried himself, straight-backed and alert, scanning the landscape with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years on the frontier. His horse, a magnificent chestnut mare, moved with the fluid grace that spoke of excellent breeding and careful training. Behind him rode two younger men, clearly following his lead. All three wore the practical clothing of working cowboys. Sturdy boots, well-worn hats and gun belts that suggested they knew how to use the weapons they carried. But there was something different about them, something that set them apart from the drifters and troublemakers who occasionally passed through Millfield. Inside the house, Jeremiah had noticed the approaching riders as well. He stood from the kitchen table, his bulky frame blocking the light from the window as he squinted toward the horizon. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle that hung above the fireplace, a gesture that had become second nature whenever strangers appeared. At his door. "Dorothy," he barked, "get inside the bedroom and stay there until I tell you different." His wife nodded quickly and scurried away, her footsteps light on the wooden floor. Years of living with Jeremiah had taught her to make herself invisible. When tension filled the air, the riders were close enough now that Clara May could make out more details. The lead man appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a neatly trimmed beard that framed a strong jawline. There was something in his eyes, even from this distance, that spoke of intelligence and determination. His companions looked younger, probably in their early 20s, and they flanked him with the easy coordination of men who'd ridden together for years. Clara May quickly finished gathering the eggs and hurried toward the house, knowing that Jeremiah would expect her to be out of sight when the strangers arrived. But as she rounded the corner of the building, carrying her basket of eggs, she found herself directly in the path of the approaching riders. The lead man pulled his horse to a gentle stop just a few feet away from her. Up close, Clara May could see that her first impressions had been correct. This was no ordinary drifter. His clothes were well made but practical, his gear was top quality, and his horse was clearly worth more than most people in Millfield made. In a year. But it was his eyes that struck her most forcefully. They were kind, with an intelligence that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. "Morning, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a polite gesture. His voice was deep and pleasant, with just the hint of a southern accent. "Name's Thomas Mackenzie. These are my associates, Jake Morrison and Ben Crawford. We're looking for Jeremiah Hartwell. Would this be his place?" Clara May nodded, suddenly very aware of her appearance. Her dress was stained with mud and pig waste. Her hair hung in unwashed tangles, and she probably smelled like the barnyard animals she'd been tending. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she gestured toward the house. "Yes, sir," she managed to whisper. He's inside." Thomas Mackenzie's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in her condition. Clara May saw his gaze linger on the bruises that dotted her arms, some fresh, others faded to yellow and green. She instinctively pulled the sleeves of her dress down to cover the marks, but it was too late. The cowboy had seen them. "And you are?" he asked gently. "Clara May," she replied, her voice barely audible. Before Thomas could respond, the front door of the house slammed open and Jeremiah Hartwell stepped onto the porch. He carried his rifle casually, but his message was clear. These visitors were not necessarily welcome. "You men got business here?" Jeremiah called out, his voice carrying the edge of barely controlled aggression. Thomas Mackenzie dismounted from his horse with fluid grace, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, but somehow conveying a quiet confidence that made Jeremiah shift uncomfortably on the porch. The two younger cowboys remained mounted but alert, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "Mr. Hartwell," Thomas said, approaching the porch with measured steps. "I'm Thomas Mackenzie from the Lazy M Ranch down in Colorado. I believe you have some cattle that belong to me." Jeremiah's face reddened slightly, and Clara May saw his knuckles whiten as his grip tightened on the rifle. She'd seen that look before. It was the expression he wore just before his temper exploded into violence. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jeremiah growled. All the cattle on this ranch are mine, legally purchased and properly branded." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a folded piece of paper and held it up for Jeremiah to see. "Here's a bill of sale from the Kansas City stockyards," Thomas said calmly. "Shows that 27 head of prime Colorado beef were sold to a buyer who gave the name James Harrison. Funny thing is, James Harrison doesn't exist, but the description of the man who made the purchase matches you pretty well, Mr. Hartwell. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife." Clara May found herself frozen in place, still holding her basket of eggs, as she watched the confrontation unfold. She'd never seen anyone stand up to Jeremiah like this. Certainly no one had ever challenged him with such quiet confidence. Jeremiah took a step forward, raising his rifle slightly. "You calling me a thief, stranger?" "I'm calling you a man who has cattle that don't belong to him," Thomas replied evenly. "Question is whether you came by them honestly or not. The brands on those animals will tell the story." Behind Thomas, his two companions had dismounted as well, their movements casual but purposeful. Clara May noticed that they'd positioned themselves to cover different angles of approach to the porch. These were clearly men with experience in dangerous situations. "Get off my land," Jeremiah snarled, bringing the rifle up to his shoulder. "Now before you what?" Thomas interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying a new undertone of steel. "Before you shoot an unarmed man in front of witnesses? Before you add murder to cattle theft?" The standoff stretched for several tense seconds. Clara May held her breath, certain that violence was about to erupt. She'd seen Jeremiah's rages before, but never directed at armed men who looked capable of defending themselves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Hartwell. My associates and I are going to ride out to your pasture and take a look at those cattle. If they're wearing brands that have been altered, or if we find animals that match the descriptions on my bills of sale, then we'll be loading them up and taking them home. If not, we'll apologize for the inconvenience and be on our way." Jeremiah's face was purple with rage now, veins bulging in his neck as he struggled to control his temper. Clara May could see the calculations running through his mind. 3 armed men against 1, with neighbors close enough to hear gunshots and ask questions later. "You got no authority here," he finally managed to say through gritted teeth. Thomas reached into his vest and withdrew a small metal badge. "Actually, I do. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal, Mr. Hartwell. Cattle theft is a federal crime when it crosses state lines, which gives me all the authority I need." The revelation hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged slightly, and Clara May saw some of the fight go out of him. He was a bully and a thief, but he wasn't stupid enough to shoot a federal marshal in broad daylight. As the adults continued their tense conversation, Clara May found herself studying Thomas Mackenzie more carefully. There was something about him that was different from any man she'd ever encountered. He carried himself with quiet authority, but without the cruel arrogance that characterized Jeremiah and most of the other men she'd known. When he'd spoken to her, his voice had been gentle and respectful, as if she were a person worthy of consideration rather than just another piece of farm equipment. The thought struck her as strange. In her 16 years of life, she'd rarely been treated with basic human dignity, let alone respect. Her own stepfather regarded her as less valuable than his livestock, and most of the townspeople of Millfield either ignored her existence or whispered about the pig girl who lived at the Hartwell Ranch. Thomas Mackenzie finished his conversation with Jeremiah and turned back toward his horse. As he passed Clara May, he paused and looked directly at her with those intelligent, kind eyes. "Miss Clara May," he said quietly, so that only she could hear, "are you all right?" The simple question hit her like a thunderbolt. When was the last time anyone had asked about her welfare? When had anyone cared enough to notice that she might not be all right? She nodded quickly, afraid to trust her voice, but Thomas didn't seem convinced. His gaze took in the bruises on her arms again, the filthy condition of her clothing, and the way she instinctively flinched when Jeremiah's voice rose from the porch. "If you ever need help," he said softly, "the Lazy M Ranch is about 2 days. Right south of here, just outside of Cedar Creek, Colorado. You ask anyone in town, they'll tell you how to find it." Before Clara May could respond, Thomas Mackenzie mounted his horse and rode away with his companions, heading toward the distant pasture where Jeremiah's cattle grazed. She stood in the yard long after they disappeared from view, his words echoing in her mind like a prayer she'd never dared to speak. For the first time in 3 years, Clara May allowed herself to imagine that somewhere in the world there might be people who would treat her with kindness and respect. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. After so many years of abuse and neglect, the possibility of genuine human decency seemed almost too good to be true. But as she made her way back to the pig pen to continue her chores, Clara May carried with her the memory of Thomas Mackenzie's kind eyes and gentle voice. And for the first time since her father's death, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't have to end in the mud and filth of Jeremiah Hartwell's ranch. 3 hours later, Thomas Mackenzie and his men returned from the pasture, with grim expressions and 27 head of cattle bearing telltale signs of brand alteration. The original Lazy M brand had been crudely changed to resemble Jeremiah's HH mark, but the expert eyes of experienced ranchers could easily spot the deception. Fresh scar tissue told the story of recent burning, and the uneven lines revealed the amateur nature of the rebranding work. Clara May watched from behind the chicken coop as Jeremiah emerged from the house, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The federal marshal's badge had stripped away his usual bluster, leaving him with the cornered desperation of a man who knew his crimes had finally caught up with him. "Mr. Hartwell," Thomas called out as he dismounted, "we've found what we were looking for. These cattle will be returning to Colorado with us, along with compensation for the time and expense of tracking them down." Jeremiah's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "You can't prove nothing," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. Jake Morrison, the younger of Thomas's companions, led one of the disputed cattle forward. The animal bore clear evidence of the brand modification, raised scar tissue where the original mark had been burned over with crude ironwork. "This here's all the proof we need," Jake said quietly. "Any judge in the territory would convict on evidence like this." The financial implications hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Those 27 head represented nearly 2 years' worth of his legitimate income, and their loss would cripple his already struggling ranch operation. But it was the potential legal consequences that truly terrified him. Cattle theft was a hanging offense in most frontier territories. Thomas seemed to read the calculation in Jeremiah's eyes. "Now, Mr. Hartwell, I'm prepared to handle this matter quietly between gentlemen. You return my cattle, compensate me for my troubles, and we'll consider the matter settled. Otherwise, I'll be filing charges with the territorial court, and you'll be explaining your business practices to a judge and jury." The offer was more generous than Jeremiah deserved, and everyone present knew it. Clara May had heard enough stories to understand that most cattle thieves ended their careers at the end of a rope, not through negotiated settlements. "What kind of compensation you talking about?" Jeremiah asked through gritted teeth. $500, Thomas replied without hesitation, "plus a signed confession stating that you took the cattle without authorization. That way, if any more of my livestock go missing in this area, I'll know exactly where to start looking." $500 was more money than the Hartwell Ranch generated in 6 months of legitimate operation. Clara May saw her stepfather's face cycle through anger, fear, and desperate calculation as he weighed his limited options. "I don't have that kind of money," he finally admitted. Thomas nodded, as if he'd expected this response. His eyes swept across the ranch, taking in the modest buildings, the small herd of remaining cattle, and the general air of barely controlled poverty that characterized the operation. "Then we'll have to work something else out," the marshal said. "Jake, Ben, start separating our cattle from the rest of the herd. We'll be taking them and whatever other assets might cover the debt." The threat was clear, and Jeremiah understood it perfectly. His remaining cattle, his land, even his house, could be seized to satisfy the debt he'd created through his theft. The prospect of losing everything sent him into a panic that Clara May had never seen before. "Wait!" he called out desperately. "There's got to be some other arrangement we can make." Thomas paused in his instructions to his men. "I'm listening." Jeremiah's eyes darted around the ranch, searching for anything of value that might satisfy the debt. His gaze fell on Clara May, still hiding behind the chicken coop, and a calculating expression crossed his face that made her blood run cold. "The girl," he said suddenly, "she's worth something to the right buyer. Plenty of men out here looking for wives, and she's young and strong enough for hard work." The words hit Clara May like a physical blow. She'd known that Jeremiah despised her, but the casual way he discussed selling her like livestock revealed a depth of cruelty that shocked even her. Behind the kitchen window, she could see her mother's horrified face, hands pressed against the glass in silent anguish. Thomas Mackenzie's expression darkened considerably. "Are you suggesting what I think?" "You're suggesting, Mr. Hartwell? Girl's got to be worth $100 to someone," Jeremiah continued, warming to his theme. "Maybe more if she cleans up decent. That's a fifth of what you're asking, and it's better than nothing." The silence that followed Jeremiah's proposal was deafening. Clara May felt her world spinning as she realized that her stepfather was literally attempting to sell her to pay his debts. The casual nature of his suggestion, as if she were no different from a horse or a cow, struck her with devastating force. "Thomas." Mackenzie dismounted from his horse with deliberate slowness, his movements carrying a barely controlled tension that made even Jeremiah take a step backward. When the marshal spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with unmistakable menace. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, "I've seen a lot of low things in my years on the frontier, but suggesting the sale of a young woman like she was livestock might just be the lowest. You're talking about human trafficking, which is not only morally reprehensible, but also a federal crime that carries a sentence of 20 years in federal prison." Jeremiah's face went pale as he realized the legal implications of his suggestion. In his desperation, he'd crossed a line that even his crude frontier sensibilities should have recognized as forbidden. "I didn't mean nothing improper," he backtracked, quickly. "Just talking about finding her a husband, proper-like. Girl's got no prospects here, and—" "The girl," Thomas interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade, "is a human being with rights and dignity, not a commodity to be traded for your debts. And her name is Clara May, not the girl." Clara May felt tears spring to her eyes at hearing someone defend her humanity. In 3 years of living with Jeremiah, no one had ever stood up for her in such a direct and forceful way. The simple act of hearing her name spoken with respect rather than contempt felt like a revelation. Thomas turned away from Jeremiah and walked directly toward Clara May's hiding place behind the chicken coop. She froze, uncertain whether to run or stay, but something in his approach suggested that he meant her no harm. "Miss Clara May," he said gently when he reached her, "I'd like to speak with you if that's all right." She nodded, still too overwhelmed by the morning's events to trust her voice. Thomas studied her face carefully, and she could see him taking note of every bruise, every sign of neglect and abuse that marked her appearance. "How long have you been living like this?" he asked quietly. 3 years, she whispered. "Since," My ma married him. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And your mother? Does he treat her the same way? Clara May glanced toward the kitchen window, where Dorothy still stood watching the confrontation with frightened eyes. He hurts her too, but not as much as me. Says I'm not his blood, so I don't deserve nothing better. The marshal was quiet, for a long moment, absorbing the full scope of the situation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of decision that Clara May didn't fully understand. Clara May, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What I'm about to say might sound impossible, but I need you to trust me. Would you like to leave this place? The question struck her like lightning. Leave. The thought had occurred to her countless times during the darkest moments of the past 3 years, but it had always seemed impossible. Where would she go? How would she survive? She had no money, no skills beyond farm work, and no connections to anyone who might help her. I don't have nowhere to go, she said softly. What if you did? Thomas pressed gently. What if there was a place where you'd be treated with respect and kindness, where you could learn new skills and make something of yourself? Clara May's heart began to race. Was he really suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? The possibility seemed too wonderful to be real. My ranch in Colorado is always looking for good people, Thomas continued. We've got a cook who could use help in the kitchen, and my sister-in-law runs a school for the local children. You could learn to read and write properly, maybe even teach others someday. Most importantly, you'd be safe and treated like the valuable person you are. The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Clara May had dreamed of escape so many times that the reality of it seemed surreal. Could this stranger really be offering her a new life, just like that? But what about Ma? She asked, glancing again toward the house. Thomas followed her gaze. We'll figure something out for your mother too if she wants help. But right now, I'm most concerned about getting you away from a man who thinks you're something to be sold. Behind them, Jeremiah had been growing increasingly agitated as he watched the private conversation between Thomas and Clara May. His earlier fear was giving way to the familiar rage that had dominated his interactions with his stepdaughter for 3 years. "Hey!" he shouted. "You got no right talking to her without my permission. She's part of this household and—" Thomas turned slowly to face Jeremiah, and something in his expression made the bigger man's words die in his throat. The marshal's earlier politeness had vanished, replaced by the cold authority of a man, accustomed to dealing with the worst elements of frontier society. "Mr. Hartwell," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the ranch yard with unmistakable finality, "your authority over this young woman extends only as far as the law allows, and the law does not permit you to abuse, neglect, or attempt to sell her. In fact, what I've witnessed here today gives me probable cause to arrest you for several federal crimes." The threat was not idle, and Jeremiah knew it. Federal marshals carried broad authority, and the evidence of his abuse was written across Clara May's bruised and neglected appearance. His bluster collapsed entirely as the reality of his situation became clear. "Now," Thomas continued, "I'm going to make you an offer, and you're going to accept it because it's the only thing standing between you and a federal prison cell. I'm taking my cattle, and I'm taking Clara May. In exchange, I won't file charges for cattle theft, attempted, human trafficking, or child abuse. You'll sign a document relinquishing any claim to authority over her, and you'll never contact her again. Do we have an understanding?" Clara May's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that her entire future hung in the balance of Jeremiah's response. The man who had made her life a living hell for 3 years now held the power to grant or deny her freedom with a single word. Jeremiah looked around the ranch yard, taking in the faces of the 3 armed men who had turned his world upside down in the space of a few hours. His stolen cattle were already being separated from his legitimate herd. His debts remained unpaid, and now he faced the loss of what he'd considered his free labor source. But the alternative, federal charges that could result in decades in prison or even execution, was far worse than any financial loss. With the slow, deliberate movements of a man accepting defeat, Jeremiah nodded his agreement. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Take her. She's been nothing but trouble anyway." Even in the moment of her liberation, Jeremiah's cruelty cut deep. Clara May felt tears of both relief and pain as she realized that the man who had claimed authority over her for 3 years was discarding her as casually as he might throw away a broken tool. Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Go get whatever belongings you want to take with you," he said quietly. "We'll wait." Clara May looked toward the small shed that had served as her prison for the past 6 months. Everything she owned in the world could fit in a single flour sack, a few pieces of worn clothing, her father's old pocket watch, and a small wooden cross that her mother had carved for her years earlier. As she gathered her meager possessions, Clara May could hear Thomas giving quiet instructions to his companions. They would drive the recovered cattle toward Colorado, while he escorted Clara May to safety. The practical arrangements of her rescue were being handled with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized everything else about the mysterious marshal. When she emerged from the shed with her belongings, Clara May found Thomas waiting with a gentle mare, already saddled and ready for riding. The horse was smaller and calmer than his own mount, clearly chosen with her comfort and safety in mind. "Can you ride?" he asked. "A little," she replied. Her father had taught her the basics years earlier, though she'd had little opportunity to practice since his death. "This is Daisy," Thomas said, stroking the mare's neck. "She's got the gentlest disposition of any horse I've ever known. She'll take good care of you on the trail." As Clara May approached the horse, she was struck by yet another example of Thomas Mackenzie's thoughtfulness. In a few hours, he'd completely upended his own plans to help a stranger, arranged for her transportation, and was now preparing to escort her across dangerous frontier territory to safety. The generosity seemed almost incomprehensible to someone who had lived for years without experiencing basic human kindness. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas paused in checking the mare's saddle straps. "Because everyone deserves a chance at a decent life," he said simply, "and because I've got a daughter about your age back in Colorado. I'd hope that if she ever needed help, someone would be there for her the way I'm here for you." The mention of his daughter added another layer to Clara May's understanding of her rescuer. He wasn't just a federal marshal or a successful rancher. He was a father who understood the value of protecting young people from harm. The knowledge made her feel safer and more hopeful about the journey ahead. Behind them, Dorothy Hartwell appeared on the porch of the house, her face streaked with tears as she watched her daughter prepare to leave forever. The older woman started forward, as if to speak, but Jeremiah grabbed her arm roughly and pulled her back inside. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the ranch yard. Clara May stared at the closed door, her heart breaking at the realization that she might never see her mother again. Despite everything that had happened, Dorothy was still the woman who had raised her, sung her lullabies, and tried to protect her as much as she could within the constraints of her own terrifying situation. Thomas noticed her distress and moved closer. "I know this is hard," he said gently. "Leaving family is never easy, even when it's necessary for your safety. But this isn't necessarily goodbye forever. Once you're settled and safe, we can figure out ways to help your mother if she wants our help." His words offered a small measure of comfort, but Clara May knew that the woman watching from behind the kitchen window was no longer the strong, loving mother she remembered from before Jeremiah entered their lives. Fear had broken Dorothy's spirit so completely that Clara May doubted her mother would ever find the courage to seek help, no matter how desperately she might need it. As the small group prepared to leave the Hartwell Ranch, Clara May took one. Let's look around the place that had been her prison for 3 years. The pig pen, where she'd been forced to sleep. The shed that had served as her bedroom. The chicken coop where she'd hidden from Jeremiah's rages. All of it would soon be nothing more than painful memories. But for the first time since her father's death, Clara May was looking toward a future that held the promise of something better. The road ahead was uncertain and probably dangerous, but it led away from abuse and toward the possibility of respect, education, and genuine human kindness. Thomas Mackenzie mounted his horse and gestured for his companions to begin moving the recovered cattle toward the trail. As Clara May climbed carefully onto Daisy's back, she felt the mare's steady strength beneath her and drew comfort from the animal's calm disposition. "Ready?" Thomas asked. Clara May took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision that would change everything about her life. Behind her lay 3 years of suffering and degradation. Ahead lay the unknown, guided by a man who had already shown her more kindness in a few hours than she'd experienced in years. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. As they rode away from the Hartwell Ranch, Clara May didn't look back. The chapter of her life that had begun with such tragedy and continued with such pain was finally closing. Whatever challenges lay ahead on the trail to Colorado, they couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. And for the first time in 3 years, Clara May allowed herself to believe that her story might have a happy ending after all. The first day of travel stretched endlessly before Clara May as she adjusted to life in the saddle. Thomas had set a steady but comfortable pace, allowing her to grow accustomed to riding while keeping his recovered cattle moving south toward Colorado. The landscape of Nebraska rolled past in waves of prairie grass and scattered farmsteads, each mile taking her further from the only life she'd ever known. By midday, the muscles in Clara May's legs and back screamed in protest from the unfamiliar exertion of horseback riding. Thomas noticed her discomfort and called for a rest beside a small creek that meandered through a grove of cottonwood trees. The shade provided welcome relief from the intense summer sun, and the sound of flowing water created a peaceful backdrop that was worlds away from the tension of the Hartwell Ranch. "How are you holding up?" Thomas asked as he helped her dismount from Daisy. "I'm fine," Clara May replied automatically, though the tremor in her legs made her words less than convincing. Thomas studied her face with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading people. "It's all right to admit when you're struggling," he said gently. "Learning to ride long distances takes time, and there's no shame in needing breaks." The kindness in his voice nearly brought tears to Clara May's eyes. After years of being told that any sign of weakness would result in punishment, the concept of admitting difficulty without fear of consequences was revolutionary. She nodded gratefully and sank down onto a fallen log, trying to work the stiffness out of her aching muscles. Jake Morrison and Ben Crawford had spread out along the creek bank, keeping watch over the grazing cattle while their animals drank and rested. Clara May observed the easy camaraderie between the 3 men, noting how they communicated with subtle gestures and shared responsibilities without needing explicit instructions. These were clearly people who had worked together for years and trusted each other completely. Thomas settled beside her on the log, pulling a piece of jerky from his saddlebag and offering it to her. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" he asked. Clara May had to think about the question. Jeremiah's household operated on a strict hierarchy when it came to food. He ate first and best. Dorothy received whatever remained, and Clara May got the scraps that were left over. Often those scraps consisted of little more than stale bread and whatever vegetables were too old or damaged to be worth preserving. "I don't remember," she admitted quietly. Thomas's expression darkened, but he kept his voice gentle. "Well, we're Going to change that starting right now. Ben's got a talent for cooking over an open fire, and we've got plenty of supplies for the trail." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Ben Crawford approached with an armload of dry wood and a cast-iron pot. The younger cowboy had sandy hair and an easy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Unlike many of the rough men Clara May had encountered in her life, Ben carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. "Figured I'd whip up some beans and bacon," Ben said, beginning to arrange stones for a cooking fire. "We've got fresh biscuits from town this morning, and there's coffee, if the lady would like some." The casual way Ben included Clara May in his meal planning struck her as remarkable. In Jeremiah's house, she'd been an afterthought at best, someone who might receive food if there happened to be any left over. The idea that someone would actively consider her needs and preferences felt almost foreign. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. As Ben worked on preparing the meal, Thomas began to tell Clara May about the Lazy M Ranch and the life that awaited her in Colorado. The ranch covered nearly 15,000 acres in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, with several hundred head of cattle and a growing operation that supplied beef to mining camps and railroad construction crews throughout the region. "It's not an easy life," Thomas explained honestly. "Ranch work is hard, and the winters can be brutal, but everyone who works for the Lazy M is treated with respect and paid fairly for their efforts. We've got a bunkhouse for single men, a main house where my family lives, and several smaller cabins for married couples and their children." Clara May tried to picture this place he described, a community where people work together by choice rather than fear, where everyone had value and purpose. The concept seemed almost too good to be true after her experiences with Jeremiah. "What would I do there?" she asked. "Whatever you're good at, and whatever you'd like to learn," Thomas replied. "My wife Sarah runs the household and could use help with cooking and cleaning. My sister-in-law Margaret teaches school for the ranch children and the kids from nearby homesteads. If you're interested in learning to read and write better, she'd be happy to work with you." The mention of education sent a thrill of excitement through Clara May. Her father had taught her basic letters and numbers before his death, but Jeremiah had forbidden any further learning, claiming that education was wasted on someone who would never amount to anything more than manual labor. "I'd like that," she said, hardly daring to believe that such opportunities might actually be available to her. Jake Morrison joined the conversation as Ben's cooking began to fill the air with appetizing aromas. The older of Thomas's two companions had dark hair and serious eyes, but Clara May had noticed that he watched their surroundings with the constant alertness of someone accustomed to danger. "Boss," Jake said quietly, "we've got company coming up the trail behind us." Thomas rose immediately, his relaxed demeanor shifting to sharp attention. Clara May followed his gaze and saw a small cloud of dust rising in the distance, indicating riders approaching at a fast pace. "How many?" Thomas asked. "Looks like 3, maybe 4, Jake replied. "They're pushing their horses pretty hard." A chill ran down Clara May's spine as she realized who the approaching riders might be. "What if it's Jeremiah?" she whispered, suddenly terrified that her stepfather had changed his mind about letting her go. Thomas's hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip. "If it is, he'll find that chasing us was a mistake," he said grimly. "But let's not borrow. Trouble could be anyone." The next few minutes passed with agonizing slowness as the riders drew closer. Clara May found herself holding her breath, torn between hope that the approaching horsemen were innocent travelers and fear that Jeremiah had somehow found a way to drag her back to the ranch. As the riders crested a small hill, Thomas relaxed. "Slightly. It's not Hartwell," he announced, "but I don't recognize them either." The approaching group consisted of 4 men on horseback, all dressed in the practical clothing of frontier travelers. They rode with the easy confidence of experienced horsemen, but something in their formation and the way they scanned the landscape suggested they were more than casual travelers. The lead rider, a tall man with a graying beard and sharp eyes, raised his hand in greeting as the group approached Thomas's camp. "Afternoon," he called out. "Mind if we water our horses at your creek?" "Not at all," Thomas replied, though Clara May noticed that he kept his hand near his weapon. "Plenty of water for everyone." As the strangers dismounted and led their horses to the creek, Clara May studied them carefully. They were well armed and appeared to be in excellent physical condition, but their gear and clothing suggested prosperity rather than the desperate poverty that characterized most frontier criminals. The leader of the group approached Thomas with the measured steps of someone accustomed to sizing up potential threats. "Name's Colonel William Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "These are my associates. We're tracking some stolen cattle that passed through this area recently." Thomas shook the offered hand, but Clara May could see the tension in his posture. "Thomas Mackenzie, U.S. Marshal. These are my men, and we're driving some recovered livestock back to Colorado." The mention of Thomas's official position seemed to ease some of the tension between the two groups. Colonel Hayes's expression shifted from cautious suspicion to professional interest. "Marshal Mackenzie," Hayes said with a slight nod of respect. "I don't suppose you've encountered a man named Jeremiah Hartwell in your travels." "We have reason to believe he's been involved in cattle theft operations throughout this region." Clara May's heart began to race as she realized that Jeremiah's crimes extended far beyond the theft of Thomas's cattle. The man who had terrorized her for 3 years was apparently a much more serious criminal than she'd realized. "As a matter of fact, I just recovered 27 head from Mr. Hartwell this morning," Thomas replied carefully. "May I ask what your interest in him might be?" Colonel Hayes glanced at his companions before responding. "We represent a consortium of ranchers from Kansas and Colorado who have been losing cattle to organized theft operations. Hartwell's name has come up in connection with several major losses over the past 2 years." The conversation that followed revealed the scope of Jeremiah's criminal activities. According to Colonel Hayes, Hartwell had been part of a network that stole cattle from ranches throughout the region, altered their brands, and sold them at distant markets where the original owners were unlikely to discover the theft. "We estimate that this operation has cost legitimate ranchers upwards of $50,000 over the past 18 months, Hayes explained. "The territorial governor has authorized us to pursue the matter with full legal authority." Thomas nodded grimly. "Well, Colonel, I'm afraid you've missed your man. When I left the Hartwell ranch this morning, Jeremiah was still there, but he's now aware that his activities have been discovered. I wouldn't be surprised if he's already fled the territory." The news clearly frustrated Colonel Hayes and his men. They'd been tracking Jeremiah for months, and the knowledge that their quarry had been warned of their approach was a significant setback. "Did you happen to recover any documentation from Hartwell's operation?" Hayes asked hopefully. "Bills of sale, correspondence, anything that might help us track down his associates?" "I'm afraid not," Thomas replied. "My focus was on recovering my own livestock and getting away from there as quickly as possible." Hayes looked disappointed, but unsurprised. "Well, Marshal, I appreciate the information. We'll head back to the Hartwell Ranch and see what we can learn, though I suspect we'll find the place abandoned." As the colonel and his men prepared to leave, Clara May found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. Part of her hoped that Jeremiah would be caught and punished for his crimes, but another part feared what might happen to her mother if he was arrested or killed. After the strangers had ridden away, Thomas returned to Clara May's side. "Are you all right?" he asked, noting her troubled expression. "I'm worried about Ma," she admitted. "If those men catch Jeremiah, what'll happen to her?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Your mother is a victim in this situation, not a criminal," he said finally. If Jeremiah is arrested, she'll likely be left to fend for herself, but she won't face legal consequences for his actions. The thought of Dorothy alone and penniless on the Nebraska frontier was deeply troubling to Clara May. Despite everything that had happened, she still loved her mother and worried about her welfare. "Could we help her?" Clara May asked hopefully. "Maybe she could come to Colorado too." "If she wants help, we'll find a way to provide it," Thomas assured her. "But she'll have to make that choice for herself. We can't force someone to accept rescue if they're not ready for it." Ben Crawford called out that the meal was ready, and the group gathered around the small fire to eat. The beans and bacon were simple fare, but to Clara May, they tasted like the finest restaurant food. The portion Ben served her was generous, and when she finished, he offered her seconds without being asked. "Eat up," Ben said with a friendly smile. "You've got some catching up to do, and we've got plenty more where that came from." The casual kindness of the gesture brought tears to Clara May's eyes. After years of scraping for every scrap of food, the abundance and generosity of her new companions seemed almost miraculous. As they ate, Jake Morrison regaled them with stories of previous cattle drives and adventures on the frontier. His tales were filled with humor and excitement, painting a picture of a life that was challenging but rewarding. Clara May found herself laughing for the first time in months, caught up in the easy camaraderie of the group. "Tell her about the time you got treed by that grizzly bear," Ben suggested with a grin. Jake's face reddened slightly. "Now that's not a story that shows me in the best light," he protested, but he launched into the tale anyway. The story involved Jake's attempt to retrieve honey from a bee tree, an unexpected encounter with a protective mother bear, and a humiliating 12-hour wait in the branches while the bear and her cubs camped below. By the time Jake finished the telling, even Thomas was laughing at his friend's misadventure. "The moral of the story," Jake concluded, "is that sometimes the sweetest prizes come with the highest costs. That honey wasn't worth nearly as much as I thought it was." Clara May realized that Jake's story contained a deeper truth about her own situation. The sweetness of freedom and respect that Thomas was offering her came with the cost of leaving behind everything familiar, including her mother. But like Jake's honey, the familiar life she was abandoning hadn't been nearly as valuable as she'd once believed. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas began to outline their travel plans for the next several days. They would continue south through Kansas, staying on established trails where possible but ready to detour around any trouble they might encounter. The journey to Colorado would take approximately a week, depending on weather and the condition of the recovered cattle. "We'll camp under the stars most nights," Thomas explained, "but there are a few towns along the way where we can get proper meals and baths if needed." The prospect of a real bath was almost as exciting to Clara May as the promise of education. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been truly clean, and the thought of washing away the grime and smell of the pig pen felt like a form of spiritual cleansing. As they prepared to resume their journey, Thomas took Clara May aside for a private conversation. "I want you to understand something," he said seriously. "What happened to you at the Hartwell Ranch was wrong. You didn't deserve that treatment, and it wasn't your fault. Sometimes people who have been hurt start to believe they somehow caused their own suffering, but that's not true in your case." His words hit Clara May with unexpected force. She had indeed begun to believe that she somehow deserved Jeremiah's cruelty, that her worthlessness was an established fact rather than his cruel opinion. "The life you're heading toward in Colorado will be different," Thomas continued. "You'll be valued for who you are, not judged for circumstances beyond your control. It might take time to adjust to being treated with respect, but I hope you'll give yourself that chance." Clara May nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she understood what Thomas meant. The concept of being valued for her inherent worth, rather than her usefulness, was so foreign that she could barely wrap her mind around it. As they mounted their horses and resumed the journey south, Clara May felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation about the future. The afternoon's encounter with Colonel Hayes had reminded her that danger still lurked in her past, but Thomas's steady presence and the kindness of his companions gave her hope that her new life would indeed be different. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon as the small group continued their journey toward Colorado. Behind them, the shadows of Nebraska stretched long across the prairie, marking the end of one chapter in Clara May's life and the beginning of another. For the first time in 3 years, Clara May looked forward to tomorrow with anticipation rather than dread. Whatever challenges lay ahead on the trail, they would be faced in the company of people who saw value in her humanity rather than reasons to diminish it. The road to Colorado stretched before them, filled with promise and possibility that Clara May was only beginning to comprehend. The third night of their journey found the group camped beside a shallow river in central Kansas, where the prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with stands of oak and hickory trees. Clara May had grown more comfortable in the saddle with each passing day, and her confidence around Thomas and his men had begun to blossom into something approaching genuine friendship. As Ben Crawford prepared their evening meal over a crackling fire, Clara May found herself volunteering to help with small tasks, gathering firewood, filling water canteens, and tending to the horses. The simple act of contributing to the group's welfare rather than being treated as a burden filled her with a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. "You're getting the hang of camp life," Jake Morrison observed as Clara May efficiently unsaddled Daisy and began brushing the mare's coat. "Most folks from town take weeks to learn what you've picked up in 3 days." The compliment warmed Clara May more than the evening fire. Throughout her life with Jeremiah, every task she'd performed had been met with criticism or indifference. The idea that someone might notice and appreciate her efforts was still novel enough to bring a flush of pride to her cheeks. Thomas returned from scouting the area around their campsite, his expression troubled in a way that immediately caught Clara May's attention. Over the past few days, she'd learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, and something had clearly disturbed him during his reconnaissance. "Problem?" Jake asked, noting his boss's expression. "Maybe," Thomas replied, settling beside the fire. "Found tracks about a quarter-mile upstream. 4 riders, all shod horses, moving parallel to our route. Could be nothing, but the spacing suggests they're keeping pace with us rather than just traveling the same direction." The implication hung heavy in the evening air. Clara May felt her stomach clench with familiar fear as she realized they might be being followed. Her first thought was of Jeremiah, despite Thomas's assurance that her stepfather wouldn't dare pursue a federal marshal. "Could it be those men we met yesterday?" Ben suggested. "Colonel Hayes and his group?" Thomas shook his head. "Hayes was heading back north toward the Hartwell Ranch. These tracks are fresh and heading south, same as us." Jake stood and checked his rifle. A gesture that Clara May had learned indicated serious concern. "Want me to circle back and take a look?" "Not yet," Thomas decided. "We'll keep normal watch tonight, but stay extra alert. If they're still with us tomorrow, we'll know for certain we're being followed." The knowledge that potential danger lurked nearby cast a shadow over what had become Clara May's favorite part of each day. The evening hours when the group relaxed around the fire, sharing stories and planning the next day's travel. Tonight, the conversation was subdued, punctuated by long silences as each person strained to hear sounds in the darkness beyond their camp. Clara May found herself thinking about the life she'd left behind at the Hartwell Ranch. The constant fear she was experiencing now was familiar, but the context was entirely different. Instead of cowering alone, while Jeremiah's rage echoed through the house, she was surrounded by capable men who were prepared to protect her. The difference was profound, even if the underlying emotion remained the same. "Miss Clara May," Thomas said quietly. "I want you to understand something about the situation we might be facing. If we are being followed, it's not necessarily about you. My work as a marshal has made me enemies, and recovering those cattle might have attracted attention we didn't expect." His words were meant to comfort her, but Clara May couldn't shake the feeling that her presence had somehow brought danger to these good people. The guilt of potentially endangering her rescuers was almost as troubling as the fear of being recaptured. "What if it is about me?" she asked softly. "What if Jeremiah sent someone after us?" Thomas considered the question seriously before responding. "Then we'll deal with it," he said simply. "You're under my protection now, and I don't abandon people who depend on me." The quiet certainty in his voice provided more comfort than any elaborate reassurance could have. Clara May was beginning to understand that Thomas Mackenzie was a man who meant exactly what he said, without embellishment or false promises. As the fire burned lower, Ben began softly humming a melody that Clara May recognized as an old hymn her father used to sing. The familiar tune brought back memories of better times, Sunday mornings when her family had attended church together, evenings when her parents had sat on the porch sharing quiet conversation while she played in the yard. "My pa used to sing that song," she said quietly. Ben's humming stopped. "Sorry, didn't mean to bring up sad memories." "It's not sad," Clara May replied, surprising herself with the realization. "It's nice to remember the good times. I'd almost forgotten there were any." The admission sparked a conversation about family memories and childhood experiences that revealed surprising depths in all three men. Jake spoke of growing up on a small farm in Missouri where his mother had taught him to read using the family Bible and old newspapers. Ben shared stories of his grandfather, a mountain man who had taught him to track animals and read weather signs. Thomas's childhood had been different from the others. The son of a successful merchant family in St. Louis, he'd received formal education and had been expected to follow his father into business. Instead, he'd chosen the frontier life, drawn by the challenge and independence it offered. "My father thought I was crazy," Thomas admitted with a chuckle, "giving up a comfortable life in the city to chase cattle thieves and sleep under the stars. But I never regretted the choice." "What made you decide to become a marshal?" Clara May asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "I saw too many good people being hurt by those who thought they could take whatever they wanted," he said finally. "Figured someone ought to stand up for folks who couldn't protect themselves." His answer resonated deeply with Clara May, who had spent 3 years as exactly the sort of person he described, vulnerable, powerless, and in desperate need of someone willing to stand up for her. The knowledge that Thomas had dedicated his life to helping people like her added another layer to her growing respect for the man. The conversation gradually faded as exhaustion from the day's travel began to take its toll. Thomas organized the watch schedule, with each man taking a turn standing guard while the others slept. Clara May had initially protested being excluded from the rotation, but Thomas had gently but firmly insisted that her safety was their responsibility, not hers. As she settled into her bedroll beneath the vast canopy of stars, Clara May reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few days. The hard ground beneath her was more comfortable than the hay-filled shed she'd called home for months, and the men sleeping nearby represented more protection than she'd felt in years. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Clara May as her mind raced with thoughts of the uncertain future ahead. Thomas had painted an attractive picture of life at the Lazy M Ranch, but she struggled to believe that such a place could really exist. Her experiences had taught her that safety and kindness were temporary conditions, liable to disappear without a warning. The sound of horses moving restlessly in the darkness caught her attention, and she saw Jake Morrison rise silently from his bedroll to investigate. His careful movements and the way he kept his hand near his weapon suggested that the disturbance was more than routine animal behavior. Clara May held her breath as Jake disappeared into the shadows beyond the firelight. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited for his return, every small sound in the darkness taking on ominous significance. When Jake finally reappeared, his expression was grim. He moved quietly to where Thomas lay sleeping and gently shook the marshal's shoulder. The two men conferred in whispers too quiet for Clara May to hear, but their body language spoke of serious concern. After a few moments, Thomas rose and began silently waking Ben. "What's happening?" Clara May whispered as the three men gathered near the fire. "We've got visitors," Thomas replied quietly. "4 riders, about half a mile out, and they're moving. Closer. Time to go." The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled activity as the group broke camp with practiced efficiency. The fire was doused and scattered, bedrolls were packed, and horses were saddled with minimal noise. Clara May marveled at how quickly her companions could transform a comfortable campsite into nothing more than empty ground. Thomas helped her mount Daisy in the darkness, his hand steady and reassuring as he checked her stirrups and reins. "Stay close to Ben," he instructed quietly. "If things go badly, he'll get you to safety while Jake and I handle the problem." The plan was simple but effective. They would move their small herd of cattle south along the riverbank, using the sound of flowing water to mask their movement. If their pursuers were indeed following them, the unexpected nighttime departure might provide enough of a head start to reach more defensible ground. As they began moving through the darkness, Clara May found herself pressed close to Ben Crawford's side, drawing comfort from his calm presence. The young cowboy seemed untroubled by the danger, treating their midnight flight as just another challenge to be met with professional competence. The cattle, initially resistant to being moved in the darkness, soon settled into a steady pace as they followed the lead animals along the riverbank. The recovered steers had been well trained before their theft, and their natural herd instincts made them manageable even under difficult conditions. Behind them, Clara May could occasionally catch sight of Thomas and Jake as they rode rear guard, watching for signs of pursuit. Their vigilance was reassuring, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence had somehow brought this danger upon them. After 2 hours of careful travel, Thomas called a halt in a grove of trees that provided natural concealment while offering multiple escape routes if needed. The cattle were allowed to rest and graze while the humans took stock of their situation. "Any sign of them?" Ben asked quietly. "Nothing since we left camp," Jake reported. "Either we lost them or they were never following us in the first place." Thomas remained skeptical. "We'll assume they're still out there until we know otherwise. From now on, we travel during daylight hours only, and we take turns riding point to watch for trouble." The revised security measures represented a significant change in their travel routine, but Clara May noticed that none of the men complained about the additional burden. Their willingness to accept inconvenience and danger for her sake was both humbling and deeply moving. As dawn broke over the Kansas prairie, the group resumed their journey south with renewed caution. The cattle seemed refreshed by their nighttime rest, and the cooler morning air made travel more comfortable for both animals and humans. Clara May found herself riding between Thomas and Ben, with Jake ranging ahead as their scout. The formation kept her protected while allowing the men to maintain visual contact with each other, a precaution that spoke to their professional experience in dangerous situations. The landscape through which they traveled was beautiful in the early morning light. Rolling hills covered with native grasses stretched to the horizon, broken by occasional streams and groves of trees. Clara May had never traveled far from the area around Millfield, and the vastness of the open country both thrilled and intimidated her. "It's beautiful," she said softly, gesturing toward the sunrise-painted prairie. "Wait until you see Colorado," Thomas replied with a smile. "The mountains there will take your breath away. On a clear day, you can see snow-capped peaks that look like they're touching the sky itself." His description fired Clara May's imagination. She'd heard stories of the Rocky Mountains, but had never expected to see them herself. The thought that she would soon be living among such natural wonders seemed almost too fantastic to believe. As the morning progressed, Jake Morrison rode back from his scouting position with news that both relieved and concerned the group. He'd found no sign of their potential pursuers, but he had discovered evidence of recent Indian activity in the area, unshod horse tracks, and the remains of a hunting camp that appeared to be only a few days old. "Probably just a hunting party," Jake reported, "but they were moving in the same general direction we are. Might want to adjust our route to avoid any misunderstandings." Thomas studied the surrounding terrain before making his decision. "We'll swing west for a few miles, then pick up the main trail again once we're clear of this area. Better to add some distance than to risk trouble." The detour took them through rougher country, where rocky outcroppings and steep-sided gullies made herding cattle more challenging. Clara May watched in admiration as Thomas and his men worked together to guide their animals through the difficult terrain, their experience and skill evident in every decision they made. By midday, they had rejoined the main trail south without incident. The brief detour had cost them time, but had also provided valuable lessons for Clara May about frontier survival. She was beginning to understand that life in this vast country required constant vigilance and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. As they stopped for their noon meal beside a small stream, Thomas pulled out a detailed map of the region and spread it on a flat rock. Clara May studied the document with fascination, trying to comprehend the distances involved in their journey and the route that lay ahead. "We're here," Thomas said, pointing to a spot on the map. "And this is where we're going." His finger traced a line south and west to a marking labeled Cedar Creek, Colorado. The distance between the 2 points seemed impossibly vast to Clara May, who had never traveled more than 20 miles from her birthplace. The realization that they still had several days of travel ahead was both exciting and daunting. "How much?" "Farther?" she asked. 3, maybe 4 more days if the weather holds and we don't run into any more delays," Thomas replied. "We'll cross into Colorado territory tomorrow, and after that it's mostly familiar country." The prospect of reaching their destination within days filled Clara May with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Soon she would meet Thomas's family and begin the new life he'd promised her. The thought was thrilling, but it also raised questions about whether she would be able to live up to their expectations. As if reading her thoughts, Ben Crawford spoke up. "You're going to love Sarah and Margaret," he said with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Mackenzie has a way of making everyone feel welcome, and Margaret's got more patience than a saint when it comes to teaching." His reassurance helped calm some of Clara May's anxieties, but she couldn't entirely shake the fear that she would somehow disappoint these generous people who had already done so much for her. The afternoon passed uneventfully as they continued their journey south through the heart of Kansas. The weather remained fair, the cattle cooperated, and no sign of pursuit or other danger appeared. For the first time since leaving the Hartwell Ranch, Clara May began to relax and truly enjoy the experience of travel. As evening approached and they began looking for a suitable campsite, Clara May reflected on how much she had changed in just a few days. The terrified, broken girl who had been sleeping with pigs less than a week earlier was giving way to someone stronger and more confident. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but the foundation was being laid for a person she had never imagined she could become. The road to Colorado stretched before them, And with each mile, Clara May felt herself moving further from the nightmare of her past and closer to the promise of a future filled with possibilities she was only beginning to understand. The morning of their 5th day brought with it the first glimpse of the Colorado Territory border, marked by a weathered wooden sign that had been shot full of holes by passing travelers. Clara May stared at the simple marker with wonder, realizing that she was further from home than anyone in her family had ever traveled. The vastness of the country was beginning to sink in, along with the magnitude of the journey Thomas had undertaken to bring her to safety. Jake Morrison rode back from his morning scout with news that lifted everyone's spirits. "Clear trail ahead, for at least 10 miles, he reported, and I spotted smoke rising from what looks like a trading post about an hour's ride south. Might be worth stopping to resupply and get news of the country ahead." Thomas considered the suggestion carefully. Their supplies were adequate, but the opportunity to gather information about conditions along their route was valuable. More importantly, Clara May hadn't had a proper wash or a chance to clean her clothes since leaving Nebraska, and the prospect of basic amenities was appealing. "We'll take a look," Thomas decided, "but we stay alert. Trading posts can attract all kinds of people, and not all of them are friendly." The broken-wheeled trading post sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that provided water for travelers and their animals. The main building was constructed of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney that sent a steady stream of smoke into the clear morning air. A smaller structure served as a stable, while various sheds and lean-tos housed supplies and equipment. As they approached the post, Clara May could see several horses tied to the hitching rail, indicating other travelers were already there. Thomas's hand moved instinctively closer to his weapon, a precaution that had become second nature during their journey. The proprietor of the broken wheel was a burly man named Samuel Torres, whose weathered face and missing left arm spoke of a hard life on the frontier. Despite his intimidating appearance, Torres greeted them with genuine warmth and offered feed for their animals and hot food for the travelers. "Don't get many folks driving cattle through here," Torres observed, as he helped them secure their animals in his corral. "Most herders take the eastern route through Dodge City. We had reasons to avoid the main trails," Thomas replied carefully, without elaborating on the nature of those reasons. Torres nodded with understanding. In frontier society, a man's past was considered his own business unless he chose to share. The unwritten code of the West protected privacy while fostering hospitality toward legitimate travelers. Inside the trading post, Clara May marveled at the variety of goods available in such a remote location. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from coffee and sugar to ammunition and mining tools. Torres's wife, a small Mexican woman named Maria, managed the domestic side of the operation with quiet efficiency. "You have facilities where the lady might clean up?" Thomas asked discreetly. Maria Torres's keen eyes took in Clara May's bedraggled appearance with immediate understanding. "Of course," she said warmly. "Come, Mija, we will make you comfortable." The kindness in the older woman's voice nearly brought tears to Clara May's eyes. Maria led her to a small room behind the main building where a tin tub could be filled with heated water. Clean towels and a bar of actual soap, luxuries Clara May had almost forgotten existed, completed the arrangements. "Take your time," Maria said gently. "I will see if I have some clothes that might fit you better than what you're wearing." Left alone for the first time in days, Clara May slowly undressed and sank into the warm water with a sigh of pure pleasure. The heat soaked into muscles that had grown accustomed to sleeping on hard ground and long hours in the saddle. More importantly, the opportunity to wash away the accumulated grime of travel felt like shedding an unwanted skin. As she scrubbed years of neglect from her body, Clara May caught sight of herself in a small mirror that hung on the wall. The face looking back at her was dramatically different from the broken, terrified girl who had hidden behind the chicken coop just a week earlier. Her cheeks had filled out slightly from regular meals, and her eyes held a spark of life that had been absent for years. Maria Torres returned with an armload of clothing, a simple blue dress that had been carefully mended, clean undergarments, and a pair of boots that looked to be approximately the right size. The garments were well worn, but clean and serviceable, representing a dramatic improvement over Clara May's previous attire. "These belong to my daughter," Maria explained. "She is grown now with children of her own, but I kept some of her things. You are welcome to them." The generosity of the gesture overwhelmed Clara May. "I don't have money to pay you," she said quietly. Maria smiled and patted her shoulder gently. "Some things cannot be paid for with money, Mija. Sometimes we help each other simply because it is right to do so." When Clara May emerged from the washing room in her new clothes, the transformation was remarkable. Thomas and his men stared in surprise at the young woman who bore little resemblance to the waif they had rescued from Jeremiah's ranch. Clean and properly dressed, Clara May looked every inch the respectable frontier woman she was meant to be. "Well, I'll be," Ben Crawford said with a grin. "You clean up mighty nice, Miss Clara May." The compliment brought a flush to her cheeks. But for the first time in years, Clara May felt deserving of positive attention. The simple act of being clean and wearing decent clothes had restored a measure of self-respect she hadn't realized she'd lost. While Clara May had been washing, Thomas had been gathering information from other travelers at the trading post. The news was mixed. The weather ahead looked favorable, but there had been reports of increased Indian activity in the area around Cedar Creek. Nothing overtly hostile, but enough to warrant caution. "The local tribes are nervous about something," reported a grizzled prospector who had come down from the mountains. "Could be nothing, but they're moving their camps more often than usual, and the young warriors are painted for war." Thomas absorbed this information with the gravity it deserved. The final leg of their journey would take them through territory where tensions between settlers and native tribes remained high. Any miscalculation could result in violence that would endanger everyone. In their group, as they prepared to leave the trading post, Samuel Torres pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation. Clara May couldn't hear their words, but the serious expressions on both men's faces suggested they were discussing something important. "What was that about?" Jake asked when Thomas rejoined the group. "Torres says there's been men asking questions." "About travelers matching our description," Thomas replied grimly. 3 riders came through yesterday, claiming to be looking for stolen cattle and a kidnapped girl. Clara May's blood ran cold as she realized that their pursuers had indeed been following them. Worse, they were apparently spreading lies about the nature of her rescue, painting Thomas as a kidnapper rather than a liberator. "Did Torres tell them anything?" Ben asked. "He told them he hadn't seen anyone matching our description," Thomas replied. "But he says they didn't seem convinced. They're probably watching the main trails south, hoping to intercept us." The news forced a change in their travel plans. Instead of following the established route to Cedar Creek, they would have to take a more circuitous path through rougher country. The detour would add at least a day to their journey, but it offered the best chance of avoiding their pursuers. As they loaded their supplies and prepared to leave, Maria Torres approached Clara May with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were additional undergarments, a warm shawl, and a few other necessities that would make life on the trail more comfortable. "For the journey," Maria explained simply, "a woman needs certain things that men do not always think to provide." Clara May's gratitude was too deep for words. In the space of a few hours, this kind stranger had restored not just her physical comfort, but also her sense of feminine dignity. The gifts represented far more than their practical value. They were an affirmation of her worth as a person. The group departed the Broken Wheel trading post with heavy hearts, knowing that their brief respite from danger was over. The pursuit, that had begun as a vague threat, was now a concrete reality, forcing them to take additional precautions that would make the remainder of their journey more difficult. Thomas led them west into broken country, where rocky outcroppings and deep ravines would make tracking more difficult. The terrain was harder on both the cattle and the horses, but it offered numerous opportunities to confuse their trail and throw off pursuit. "We'll follow the creek beds where possible," Thomas explained as they began their detour. "Running water will wash away our tracks, and the rocky ground won't hold clear impressions." The strategy was sound, but it came at a cost in speed and comfort. Progress slowed to a crawl as they navigated through narrow passages between towering rock formations. The cattle, already stressed by days of travel, became increasingly difficult to manage in the unfamiliar terrain. Clara May found herself working harder than ever before, helping to guide reluctant steers through narrow passages and around obstacles that seemed to appear around every bend. The physical demands of the work were exhausting, but she threw herself into the effort with determination born of gratitude for her rescuers' sacrifices. "You're doing great," Jake called out, as Clara May successfully maneuvered a stubborn steer around a fallen tree. Most folks would have given up by now. His encouragement meant more to Clara May than he could have known. Throughout her life with Jeremiah, her efforts had been met with criticism, regardless of their success. The simple acknowledgement of her competence was both novel and deeply satisfying. As evening approached, they made camp in a hidden valley surrounded by high walls of red sandstone. The location was defensible and concealed, but it also felt isolated in a way that reminded Clara May of her captivity at the Hartwell Ranch. The difference was that she was now surrounded by protectors rather than tormentors. Ben Crawford prepared their evening meal with his usual skill, but the mood around the fire was subdued. Everyone understood that they were being hunted, and the knowledge cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration of their approaching destination. "Tell me more about your family," Clara May said to Thomas, seeking distraction from their current troubles. "What are they like?" Thomas's expression softened as he thought about his wife and children. "Sarah's the strongest woman I've ever known," he said with obvious affection. "She came west with me when we were barely more than kids ourselves, never complained about leaving her comfortable life back east. She can cook, sew, tend sick animals, and outshoot most men I know." The picture he painted was of a woman unlike any Clara May had ever encountered. Strong, capable and independent, yet feminine and nurturing. The prospect of meeting such a person was both exciting and intimidating. "And Margaret?" Clara May prompted. "My sister-in-law is a teacher by training and temperament," Thomas replied. "She came to live with us after her husband died in a mining accident, and she's been educating the local children ever since. She's got more patience than Job and a way of making even the most reluctant student want to learn." Clara May tried to imagine herself in a classroom, struggling to read and write alongside children much younger than herself. The thought was embarrassing, but the opportunity to gain an education was worth any temporary humiliation. "What about your children?" she asked. Thomas's face lit up with paternal pride. "Rebecca's 14, smart as a whip and stubborn as a mule. She's got her mother's determination and my tendency to speak her mind, which makes for interesting conversations around the dinner table. And little Samuel is 8, all energy and curiosity. He's fascinated by everything from rocks to rabbits, and he asks more questions than a federal prosecutor." The warmth in Thomas's voice as he described his family gave Clara May hope that she would find acceptance in their household. These were clearly people who valued each other and would likely extend that same caring to someone in need. As the fire burned lower, Jake took first watch while the others prepared for sleep. Clara May settled into her bedroll with mixed emotions. Excitement about meeting Thomas's family warred with anxiety about their pursuing enemies and uncertainty about her place in this new world. During the night, she was awakened by the sound of horses moving restlessly in their makeshift corral. Jake Morrison appeared at her side almost instantly, his finger pressed to his lips in a gesture for silence. In the distance, Clara May could hear the faint sound of riders moving through the darkness. Thomas and Ben rose silently from their bedrolls, weapons in hand, as they prepared to defend their camp. The next few minutes passed in tense silence, as the sound of hoofbeats grew closer, then gradually faded as the mysterious riders continued on their way. "Think it was them?" Ben whispered when the danger had passed. "Could be," Thomas replied, quietly. "Or it could be anyone, but we're not taking any chances. We move out before dawn." The remainder of the night passed without incident. But sleep eluded Clara May as she lay staring at the stars and wondering if her presence was bringing danger to people who had already sacrificed so much for her welfare. The guilt was almost overwhelming, but she reminded herself that Thomas had made his choices with full knowledge of the risks involved. As the first hint of dawn appeared in the eastern sky, the group broke camp and resumed their journey toward the Lazy M Ranch. Somewhere ahead lay safety and the promise of a new life, but the road between their current position and that future remained fraught with danger. Clara May mounted Daisy with growing confidence, settling into the saddle with the ease of someone who had adapted to life on the trail. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the courage and determination that her rescuers had helped her discover within herself. The final stretch of their journey to Colorado was about to begin, and with it, the last chapter of Clara May's transformation from victim to survivor. The dawn of their 7th day on the trail brought with it the most breathtaking sight Clara May had ever witnessed. As they created a ridge in the foothills of Colorado, the Rocky Mountains rose before them like a wall of granite and snow that seemed to touch the very heavens. The morning light painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose, creating a vista so magnificent that it took her breath away. "Welcome to Colorado," Thomas said, with obvious pride in his voice. "Those mountains have been calling to me for 15 years, and they still stop me in my tracks every time I see them." Clara May sat transfixed in her saddle, unable to find words adequate to express the wonder she felt. The vastness and majesty of the landscape dwarfed anything she had ever imagined, making her feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something much larger than herself. "The ranch sits in that valley there," Thomas continued, pointing toward a green expanse nestled between rolling foothills. "You can't see the buildings from here, but we'll be home before sunset." The word home resonated through Clara May's mind with profound significance. For the first time in her life, she was approaching a place where she would be genuinely welcome, where her presence would be valued rather than merely tolerated. The concept was still difficult for her to fully comprehend. As they began their descent toward the valley, Jake Morrison rode back from his scouting position with concerning news. "Found fresh tracks on the main trail," he reported. 3 riders, moving fast towards Cedar Creek, could be our friends from the trading post. Thomas studied the terrain ahead with tactical precision. "How long ago?" "Hour, maybe 2 at most," Jake replied. "They're pushing their horses hard, probably trying to get ahead of us and set up an ambush somewhere between here and the ranch." The news forced another strategic decision. They could continue their current route through the backcountry, which would be safer, but would add several hours to their journey. Alternatively, they could take a more direct path that would get them to the ranch quickly, but might lead them straight into a confrontation. "What kind of men are we dealing with?" Ben asked. "Professional gunfighters or just hired muscle?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "From what Torres told me, they presented themselves as legitimate representatives of the territorial government. That suggests they're either very good liars or they have some kind of official backing. The implications of official involvement in their pursuit sent a chill through Clara May. If Jeremiah had somehow convinced territorial authorities that she had been kidnapped, Thomas could face serious legal consequences for helping her. The thought that her rescue might result in punishment for her protectors was almost unbearable. "Maybe I should go back," she said quietly. "If this is all about me, I don't want you getting in trouble with the law." Thomas turned to look at her, with an expression that was both gentle and firm. "Clara May, you're not going back to that life no matter what happens. What Jeremiah did to you was wrong, and no law worthy of the name would force you to return to that situation." His certainty was comforting, but Clara May couldn't shake her guilt over the danger her presence was creating. These good men were risking their lives and livelihoods for someone they barely knew, and the magnitude of their sacrifice weighed heavily on her conscience. "Besides," Jake added with a grin, "we've come too far to quit now. Sarah would never forgive us if we showed up without you after all the stories the boss has been telling about his rescued damsel." The joke helped lighten the mood, but the underlying tension remained as they continued their descent toward the valley floor. Every shadow and rock formation could potentially conceal armed men, and the closer they got to their destination, the more dangerous the situation became. As they approached a narrow pass between two hills, Thomas called a halt and studied the terrain with growing concern. The passage represented a perfect location for an ambush: high ground on both sides, limited escape routes, and a clear field of fire for anyone positioned on the ridges above. "We'll have to change it," he finally decided. "There's no other way to reach the ranch without adding half a day to our journey, and we need to get these cattle to water soon." Jake and Ben took positions on either side of the herd, while Thomas rode alongside Clara May, his hand resting casually on his rifle. The formation would allow them to respond quickly to threats from any direction while keeping Clara May protected in the center of the group. As they entered the pass, Clara May felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The high walls on either side seemed to close in around them, creating an atmosphere of claustrophobic tension that reminded her of the worst moments at Jeremiah's ranch. She forced herself to breathe steadily and focus on Daisy's rhythmic gait rather than the imagined threats lurking above. They were halfway through the pass when the first shot rang out, echoing off the rocky walls like thunder. Thomas immediately spurred his horse toward Clara May, using his body to shield her while shouting instructions to his men. "Jake, take the right ridge. Ben, get the cattle moving. Clara May, stay low and follow me." More shots followed as their attackers revealed their positions on both sides of the pass. Clara May caught glimpses of muzzle flashes from the rocks above, but Thomas was already guiding her toward a cluster of boulders that would provide cover from the crossfire. Behind them, Jake Morrison had dismounted and was returning fire with his rifle, using his horse as cover while he tried to suppress the shooters on the right side of the pass. Ben Crawford was working frantically to keep the cattle from stampeding, knowing that a panicked herd could be as dangerous as the gunman. "Above, how many?" Thomas called out as he pulled Clara May behind the protective rocks. "At least 4, maybe more," Jake replied between shots. "They've got good positions, and they're not amateurs." The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Clara May had ever experienced. The sound of rifle fire echoed continuously through the pass, punctuated by the ricochets of bullets striking stone and the nervous lowing of frightened cattle. She pressed herself against the rocks and tried to make herself as small a target as possible. Thomas was firing methodically, choosing his shots carefully to conserve ammunition while keeping their attackers pinned down. His calm professionalism in the face of mortal danger was both reassuring and impressive. This was clearly a man who had faced similar situations before and survived through skill and courage. "We need to move," he called out during a brief lull. "In the firing. They'll try to flank us if we stay here too long." The problem was that any movement would expose them to fire from multiple directions. Their current position provided good cover but no escape route, making them sitting targets for attackers who could take their time and wait for clear shots. Suddenly, the sound of additional gunfire erupted from the far end of the pass. But these new shots were coming from a different direction. Clara May saw Thomas's expression change from concern to relief as he recognized what was happening. "Cavalry!" he shouted with obvious satisfaction. "Someone heard the shooting and came to investigate." The new arrivals were a patrol of territorial militia who had been conducting routine sweeps of the area. Led by a sergeant named Murphy, the 6-man unit had responded to the sound of gunfire with the efficiency of experienced soldiers. Caught between two groups of armed men, the ambushers quickly realized their position had become untenable. Within minutes, the shooting stopped as the attackers attempted to escape through the rocks above the pass. Most managed to flee, but one was wounded and captured by the militia patrol. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Clara May found herself shaking with reaction to the violence she had witnessed. Thomas appeared at her side, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries and offered quiet reassurance. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." The captured ambusher turned out to be a professional gunman named Dutch Keller, whose reputation for violence was known throughout the territory. Under questioning, he revealed that he and his associates had been hired by a man claiming to represent the Nebraska territorial government to retrieve a kidnapped girl and arrest her abductor. "Said there was a federal marshal gone rogue," Keller explained, trying to bargain for leniency. "Told us he'd stolen some cattle and kidnapped a young woman, and that there was a reward for bringing them back." Sergeant Murphy examined Thomas's credentials and quickly determined that the accusations against him were false. The real story became clear as Clara May tearfully explained her situation to the militia commander, describing years of abuse and the circumstances of her rescue. "Sounds like someone's been spinning quite a tale," Murphy observed grimly. "I'll be sending a report to the territorial governor about this business. If there are corrupt officials involved in harassing legitimate citizens, they'll answer for it." The revelation that their pursuers had been operating under false pretenses was both a relief and a source of anger for Thomas and his men. They had been forced to travel in fear and fight for their lives because of lies told by people who should have been upholding justice rather than perverting it. As the militia patrol prepared to escort the captured gunman back to town, Sergeant Murphy offered to provide an escort for the remainder of Thomas's journey to the ranch. The offer was gratefully accepted, as the presence of territorial soldiers would deter any further attempts at ambush. With their immediate safety assured, the group was finally able to complete the last miles of their journey without constant vigilance. Clara May found herself relaxing for the first time in days, allowing herself to truly appreciate the beauty of the Colorado landscape that surrounded them. The Lazy M Ranch appeared before them like something from a dream. Nestled in a valley, between gentle hills, the complex of buildings was larger and more prosperous looking than anything Clara May had imagined. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that spoke of peaceful evenings and family gatherings. Surrounding the main house were various outbuildings, a large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and smaller structures that served specialized functions. Gardens and fruit trees added touches of domesticity to the working ranch environment, creating an impression of a place where people had built not just a business, but a genuine home. As they approached the main house, figures appeared on the porch. Clara May's heart began to race as she realized she was about to meet the people who would determine whether her new life would be everything Thomas had promised. Sarah Mackenzie was a woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair and intelligent, green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple but well-made dress that spoke of practical elegance, and her bearing conveyed the quiet strength that Thomas had described. Beside her stood Margaret Sullivan, Thomas's sister-in-law, whose dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and whose gentle face radiated the patience and kindness that had made her a beloved teacher. Two children, Rebecca and young Samuel, completed the welcoming committee, their faces bright with curiosity about the stranger their father had brought home. "Thomas!" Sarah called out with obvious relief and joy. "We were beginning to worry. The territorial patrol came through yesterday saying there had been trouble on the trail." Thomas dismounted and embraced his wife, his relief at being home safe evident in every line of his body. Clara May remained on Daisy, suddenly uncertain about her reception and overwhelmed by the reality of meeting these people who had loomed so large in her imagination. "Sarah Margaret," Thomas said, turning to include Clara May in the conversation. "I'd like you to meet Clara May. She's the young woman I told you about in my letter." Sarah Mackenzie approached Daisy with a warm smile that immediately put Clara May at ease. "Welcome to the Lazy M," she said simply. "I hope you'll come to think of this as your home." The words were exactly what Clara May needed to hear, spoken with a sincerity that could not be doubted. As she dismounted from Daisy and found herself enveloped in Sarah Mackenzie's welcoming embrace, Clara May felt the last of her defenses crumble. For the first time since her father's death, she was truly safe. The journey that had begun in a pig pen in Nebraska was ending in the arms of people who saw her as worthy of love and protection. The transformation was complete. Clara May had found not just refuge, but a real home. "Come," Sarah said gently, taking Clara May's arm. "Let's get you settled in. You must be exhausted from your journey." As they walked toward the house together, Clara May looked back once at the mountains that surrounded the valley. Those towering peaks would serve as guardians of her new life, standing as eternal sentinels over a place where she could finally be free to become the person she was meant to be. The nightmare was over. The dream was just beginning. Clara May's first night at the Lazy M Ranch passed in a blur of overwhelming sensations and emotions. Sarah Mackenzie had shown her to a small but comfortable room on the second floor of the main house, a space with real glass windows, a proper bed with clean sheets, and furniture that spoke of permanence and stability. After months of sleeping in a shed adjacent to a pig pen, the luxury of privacy and cleanliness felt almost supernatural. The room had belonged to Rebecca before she moved to a larger space, and traces of a young girl's presence remained in small details. A ribbon left in a drawer, a small wooden horse on the windowsill, faded marks on the wall where pictures had once hung. These remnants of normal childhood experiences served as poignant reminders of everything Clara May had missed during her years with Jeremiah. Sleep had been elusive despite her exhaustion. Every creak of the house settling, every sound from the animals in the barnyard below, sent her heart racing as instincts honed by years of hypervigilance refused to accept that she was truly safe. Several times during the night, she found herself listening for Jeremiah's heavy footsteps or the sound of the pig pen gate being opened as punishment for some imagined transgression. Morning came with gentle sounds that were entirely foreign to her experience. Sarah's voice humming softly in the kitchen below, the distant conversation of ranch hands beginning their daily chores, children's laughter echoing from somewhere outside. These were the sounds of a household at peace with itself, free from the undercurrent of fear that had characterized every moment at the Hartwell Ranch. A soft knock at her door interrupted Clara May's contemplation. "Clara May?" Margaret Sullivan's voice called gently. "May I come in?" Clara May quickly smoothed her borrowed nightgown and called for Margaret to enter. Thomas's sister-in-law appeared with a breakfast tray, her face warm with the patient kindness that had made her such an effective teacher. "I thought you might prefer to eat quietly this morning, rather than facing the entire family at the breakfast table," Margaret said, setting the tray on a small table by the window. "New situations can be overwhelming, especially after what you've been through." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Clara May's eyes. The idea that someone would consider her emotional comfort and adapt their household routine accordingly was revolutionary. At Jeremiah's house, her feelings had been irrelevant at best, sources of mockery and punishment at worst. "Thank you," Clara May managed to whisper. "That's very kind." Margaret studied her face with the perceptive gaze of someone accustomed to reading the emotions of young people. "Thomas told us a little about your situation," she said gently. "I want you to know that you're safe here, and no one will expect more of you than you're able to give. Healing takes time, and everyone recovers at their own pace." The breakfast Margaret had brought was a revelation in itself. Fresh eggs, bacon, biscuits with butter and honey, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than the bitter chicory substitute that had been standard at the Hartwell Ranch. Clara May ate slowly, savoring not just the flavors, but the simple dignity of eating real food at a proper table. As she ate, Margaret shared information about the ranch and its inhabitants in a way that was informative without being overwhelming. The Lazy M employed 12 full-time ranch hands, most of whom lived in the bunkhouse and took their meals in a separate dining hall. The Mackenzie family maintained a more formal household while ensuring that everyone who worked for them was treated with respect and fairness. "Sarah manages the domestic operations," Margaret explained. "She's incredibly capable. She can deliver a calf, mend a broken bone, and still have dinner on the table at the proper time. Thomas handles the business side of things and represents the ranch in territorial affairs. He served as a federal marshal for 8 years now, which keeps him traveling more than Sarah would like." Clara May learned that Margaret had come to live with the Mackenzies 3 years earlier, after her husband died in a mining accident that left her widowed and pregnant. The child had been stillborn, leaving Margaret devastated but determined to rebuild her life by contributing to her sister's household and educating the local children. "The schoolhouse is about a mile from here," Margaret continued. "We have 23 students, ranging in age from 6 to 16, including children from several neighboring ranches and homesteads. I teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and what I call practical knowledge, things like basic medicine, animal husbandry, and household management." The mention of education sparked Clara May's interest, despite her nervousness about her own academic limitations. "Would I be able to attend?" she asked hesitantly. Margaret's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Of course. In fact, I was hoping you'd be interested. It's never too late to expand one's education, and I think you'd find it both challenging and rewarding." The prospect of sitting in a classroom with children much younger than herself was embarrassing, but Clara May's hunger for knowledge outweighed her pride. The opportunity to learn skills that might help her contribute meaningfully to society was too valuable to pass up. A commotion in the yard below caught their attention, and Margaret moved to the window to investigate. "It looks like we have visitors," she observed. "Several men on horseback, and they don't look like neighbors." Clara May's blood ran cold as her first thought went to their pursuers from the trail. Had the remaining gunmen somehow tracked them to the ranch? Were Jeremiah's lies about her kidnapping still causing problems for Thomas and his family? "Stay here," Margaret instructed, her voice taking on a protective tone that reminded Clara May of Thomas's authoritative manner during dangerous situations. "I'll find out what's happening and let you know if there's any cause for concern." Left alone, Clara May pressed herself against the window frame where she could observe the scene below without being easily seen. 4 men on horseback had approached the main house, their formal attire and official bearing suggesting they represented some kind of governmental authority. Thomas emerged from the barn and walked toward the visitors with the confident stride of a man comfortable with his own authority. Sarah appeared on the porch, her presence a show of family solidarity, while several ranch hands positioned themselves strategically around the yard, close enough to respond to trouble, but far enough away to avoid appearing threatening. The conversation between Thomas and the visitors was too distant for Clara May to hear clearly, but the body language of all involved suggested serious business rather than casual social interaction. Documents were produced and examined, gestures were made toward the house, and at one point the leader of the visiting group pointed directly at Clara May's window. Her heart began racing as she realized that these men were indeed connected to the pursuit that had plagued their journey from Nebraska. Despite Sergeant Murphy's assurances that the matter had been resolved, it appeared that legal complications were still arising from her rescue. After nearly 30 minutes of discussion, the visitors remounted their horses and rode away. Thomas watched them until they disappeared from view, then turned and strode quickly toward the house. Clara May could hear his boots on the stairs as he climbed to the second floor, followed by Sarah's lighter step. A gentle knock preceded Thomas's entry into her room, his expression serious but not alarmed. Sarah and Margaret flanked him, their faces showing concern but not panic. "Clara May," Thomas began, settling into a chair near the window. "We need to discuss some legal matters that have arisen regarding your situation. Nothing dangerous or immediate, but important nonetheless." The visitors, it turned out, had been representatives of the territorial court system, sent to investigate allegations that had been filed against Thomas by parties claiming to represent Nebraska Territorial Authority. While Sergeant Murphy's report had cleared up most of the confusion, formal legal proceedings had been initiated that would require resolution. "The good news," Thomas continued, "is that the court recognizes you as a victim rather than a kidnapping victim. Your testimony about the conditions at the Hartwell Ranch will be crucial in establishing that your removal from that situation was justified and necessary." Clara May felt a mixture of relief and anxiety about the prospect of testifying about her experiences. While she was grateful that the legal system was taking her side, the thought of publicly recounting years of abuse and humiliation was deeply troubling. "What exactly would I have to do?" she asked quietly. Sarah moved closer and took her hand in a gesture of support. "You would need to appear before a territorial judge and answer questions about your life at the Hartwell Ranch. The court wants to establish that you were being abused and that Thomas's actions were justified under territorial law regarding the protection of vulnerable individuals." The legal framework was complex, but the essential issue was straightforward. If Clara May could demonstrate that she had been subjected to abuse and neglect that endangered her welfare, Thomas's intervention would be legally justified under territorial statutes designed to protect women and children from domestic violence. "There's another matter we need to discuss," Thomas said, his expression growing more serious. "The court has received communications from your mother." Clara May's heart leaped at the mention of Dorothy. "Is she all right? Where is she?" "According to the documents we were shown, your mother has filed a petition with the Nebraska Territorial Court requesting information about your whereabouts and welfare. She claims that you were taken from the ranch without her knowledge or consent." The news was both encouraging and troubling. Clara May was relieved to learn that her mother was apparently safe and trying to locate her, but the suggestion that Dorothy opposed her rescue was confusing and hurtful. She signed papers, saying Jeremiah could make decisions for me, Clara May said, her voice barely above a whisper. She never tried to stop him from hurting me. Margaret's expression grew gentle as she recognized the complex emotions Clara May was experiencing. "Sometimes people do things they later regret," she said softly. "Your mother may have been as much a victim of circumstances as you were, and she might not have understood the full extent of what was happening to you." The possibility that Dorothy's apparent acquiescence to Jeremiah's treatment had been born of fear rather than indifference was something Clara May had never seriously considered. The idea that her mother might have been as trapped and helpless as she was would require a fundamental re-examination of the past 3 years. "What does this mean for me?" Clara May asked. "Do I have to go back?" "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly. "You're over 16, which means you have the right to make decisions about your own living situation under territorial law. Your mother's petition gives her the right to know where you are and to communicate with you if you're willing, but it doesn't give her the authority to force you to return to Nebraska." The relief Clara May felt at this assurance was overwhelming. The fear that legal technicalities might force her back to Jeremiah's ranch had been her greatest terror since leaving Nebraska. "However," Thomas continued, "the court would like you to consider writing a letter to your mother, explaining your situation and your decision to remain in Colorado. It would help establish that your choice is voluntary and informed." The prospect of communicating with Dorothy was both appealing and terrifying. Clara May desperately wanted to know that her mother was safe and to explain the circumstances of her departure, but she also feared that any contact might somehow provide Jeremiah with information he could use against her. "Would I have to tell her where I am exactly?" Clara May asked. "You could communicate through the territorial court system," Margaret suggested. "That way your mother would know you're safe and voluntary, but your specific location would remain confidential." The compromise seemed reasonable, offering a way to maintain contact with Dorothy while preserving Clara May's security. The prospect of eventually rebuilding a relationship with her mother, free from Jeremiah's influence, was appealing despite the complications it might create. As the morning progressed, Clara May found herself gradually adjusting to the rhythm of life at the Lazy M Ranch. Sarah included her in the preparation of the midday meal, teaching her techniques for cooking that went far beyond the basic survival skills she had learned at the Hartwell Ranch. "Cooking should be a pleasure, not just a necessity," Sarah explained as she demonstrated the proper way to knead bread dough. "When you take pride in feeding your family, the food tastes better and the whole household benefits." The concept of taking pleasure in domestic work was foreign to Clara May, who had learned to associate household chores with punishment and criticism. Watching Sarah work with obvious satisfaction and skill suggested that there might be dignity and fulfillment in creating a comfortable home environment. Rebecca Mackenzie, Thomas's 14-year-old daughter, proved to be a source of both inspiration and intimidation for Clara May. The girl possessed a confidence and self-assurance that spoke of a childhood spent in security and love, but she also demonstrated a maturity and capability that belied her years. "Papa says you've had a difficult time," Rebecca said with the directness characteristic of young people. "But he also says you're very brave and that we're lucky to have you here." The simple acceptance in Rebecca's voice was deeply moving to Clara May. Here was a girl who had been raised with every advantage, yet she was willing to welcome a stranger into her home without judgment or reservation. Young Samuel Mackenzie was even more direct in his acceptance, immediately appointing himself as Clara May's guide to the ranch and its operations. The 8-year-old possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every animal, building, and person associated with the Lazy M, and he was eager to share his expertise with someone who would listen to his enthusiastic explanations. "That's Butterscotch," Samuel announced, pointing to a golden-colored cow in the nearest pasture. She gives the best milk on the whole ranch, but you have to watch out for her left hind foot because she kicks if you're not careful." His innocent chatter provided a welcome distraction from the more serious concerns that weighed on Clara May's mind. The boys' uncomplicated friendship was exactly what she needed as she began to navigate the complex emotions surrounding her. New life. As evening approached, the Mackenzie family gathered for dinner in the main dining room of the house. Clara May found herself seated between Margaret and Rebecca, surrounded by conversation that flowed naturally between topics ranging from ranch business to territorial politics to plans for the upcoming harvest season. The contrast with mealtimes at the Hartwell Ranch could not have been more pronounced. Instead of eating in fearful silence while Jeremiah dominated the conversation with complaints and threats, Clara May was witnessing a family that genuinely enjoyed each other's company and valued each member's contributions to the discussion. "Clara May," Thomas said during a lull in the conversation, "I've been thinking about your situation with the territorial court. Would you like me to arrange for you to speak with a lawyer before the hearing? Someone who could explain your rights and help you prepare for the questions you'll be asked?" The offer demonstrated yet another example of the thoughtful consideration these people showed for her welfare. The idea of facing legal proceedings without proper preparation had been a source of considerable anxiety. "I would appreciate that very much," Clara May replied gratefully. As the family dispersed after dinner to attend to evening chores and personal activities, Clara May found herself alone with Sarah in the kitchen, helping to clean the dishes and restore order to the domestic heart of the household. "You seem to be adjusting well," Sarah observed as they worked together. "I know this must all feel very strange and overwhelming." "It does," Clara May admitted, "but it's also wonderful. I keep expecting someone to tell me it's all a mistake and that I have to leave." Sarah paused in her work and turned to face Clara May directly. "This isn't a mistake, and you're not going anywhere unless you choose to," she said firmly. "Thomas and I discussed this thoroughly before he left for Nebraska. We knew we might be bringing someone home who needed time and patience to heal from difficult experiences. We're prepared for that, and we're committed to helping you build whatever kind of life you want for yourself." The sincerity in Sarah's voice was unmistakable, and Clara May felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized that these people were offering her something she had never dared hope for, a genuine family that would value her for who she was rather than what she could provide. As she prepared for her second night at the Lazy M Ranch, Clara May reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from sleeping with pigs to sharing dinner with people who treated her as an equal. The transformation seemed almost too miraculous to be real, but the evidence surrounded her in every detail of her new environment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, including her first visit to Margaret's schoolhouse and continued preparation for the legal proceedings that would formally establish her right to remain in Colorado. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Clara May would fall asleep, knowing that she was safe, valued, and genuinely welcomed in the place she was learning to call home. The nightmare of her past was finally giving way to the dream of a future filled with possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. 6 months later, Clara May stood before the mirror in her room, adjusting the collar of the blue dress that Margaret had helped her sew. Today marked a milestone she had never imagined possible, her first day as an assistant teacher at the Cedar Creek schoolhouse. The transformation from the broken girl who had slept among pigs to a confident young woman preparing to educate children seemed like something from a fairy tale. The legal proceedings that had threatened to overshadow her new life had been resolved 3 months earlier. Judge Harrison, after hearing Clara May's testimony about the conditions at the Hartwell Ranch, had ruled definitively that Thomas's actions were not only justified, but commendable. The court had formally recognized Clara May's right to remain in Colorado and had dismissed all charges against Thomas. More importantly, the proceedings had facilitated contact with her mother. Dorothy had written a heartbreaking letter explaining that she had finally found the courage to leave Jeremiah after discovering that Clara May was safe. She was now living with her sister in Kansas and working as a seamstress, slowly rebuilding her own life after years of abuse and intimidation. "I never stopped loving you," Dorothy had written. "I was just too frightened to protect you the way I should have. I thank God every day that Thomas Mackenzie was brave enough to do what I couldn't." The correspondence with her mother had been healing for Clara May, allowing her to understand that Dorothy's apparent indifference had been born of terror rather than lack of caring. They exchanged letters monthly now, and Dorothy had expressed hope that they might meet again when Clara May felt ready for such a reunion. As for Jeremiah, he had disappeared from Nebraska shortly after Clara May's departure. Colonel Hayes and his men had found the Hartwell Ranch abandoned, with evidence suggesting that Jeremiah had fled west, possibly toward California. While Clara May occasionally wondered about his fate, she found that she could think of him now without the paralyzing fear that had once consumed her thoughts. A knock at her door interrupted her preparation. "Clara May," Rebecca's voice called. "Are you ready? Margaret's waiting downstairs." Clara May took one last look in the mirror, hardly recognizing the confident young woman looking back at her. Regular meals had filled out her frame. Proper rest had restored color to her cheeks, and most importantly, months of kindness and respect had returned light to her eyes. Downstairs, Margaret waited with the pride of a teacher whose student had exceeded all expectations. Clara May's progress in reading and writing had been remarkable, driven by a hunger for knowledge that years of suppression had only intensified. She had mastered in months what typically took years, demonstrating an intelligence that had been hidden beneath layers of abuse and neglect. "Remember," Margaret said as they walked toward the schoolhouse together, "confidence is just as important as knowledge when working with children. They need to see that learning is valuable and that you believe in their ability to succeed." Cedar Creek Schoolhouse was a simple but well-maintained building that served children from a dozen ranches and homesteads scattered throughout the valley. Clara May had been attending classes there for 4 months, initially sitting alongside children much younger than herself as she worked to overcome her educational deficits. The experience had been humbling, but not humiliating, thanks to Margaret's skillful handling of the situation and the natural acceptance of the younger students. Within weeks, Clara May had progressed beyond most of her classmates and had begun helping Margaret with the youngest children during their reading lessons. Today, she would take full responsibility for teaching the 6 youngest students, while Margaret worked with the older children on more advanced subjects. It was a responsibility that both thrilled and terrified her, representing a level of trust and authority she had never experienced. As the children began arriving for the school day, Clara May felt her nervousness transform into excitement. These young faces, bright with curiosity and unmarked by the cynicism that life sometimes imposed, represented the future. Her role in shaping their minds and character was both an honor and a sacred trust. "Miss Clara May," called out 7-year-old Emma Patterson, the daughter of neighboring ranchers. "Are you really going to be our teacher today?" "I am indeed," Clara May replied with a smile that felt natural and genuine. "And we're going to have wonderful lessons together." The morning progressed better than Clara May had dared hope. The children responded to her gentle authority with enthusiasm, eager to please their new teacher and proud to demonstrate their growing skills. Clara May found herself drawing on memories of her father's patient teaching methods, combined with techniques she had learned from observing Margaret's classroom management. During the lunch break, she stepped outside to find Thomas Mackenzie waiting by the schoolhouse door. His presence always brought her comfort, reminding her of that pivotal moment when her life had changed direction forever. "How's the new teacher doing?" he asked with obvious pride in his voice. "Better than I expected," Clara May replied honestly. "I was so nervous this morning, but once I started working with the children, everything just felt right." Thomas nodded with satisfaction. "Sarah and I have been talking about your future," he said. "If teaching is truly what you want to pursue, there are opportunities for you to get formal training. The territorial government is establishing a teachers' college in Denver, and Margaret thinks you'd be an excellent candidate for their program." The possibility of formal education beyond what she was receiving at the ranch had never occurred to Clara May. The idea that she might someday earn official credentials as an educator seemed almost impossibly ambitious for someone who had been considered worthless just months earlier. "Would I be qualified for such a program?" she asked hesitantly. "Margaret believes you would excel," Thomas assured her. "Your progress has been extraordinary, and your natural ability with children is obvious to anyone who watches you work. The question isn't whether you're qualified, it's whether you're interested in pursuing that path." The afternoon session at the schoolhouse confirmed Clara May's growing sense that teaching was indeed her calling. Working with young minds, seeing the moment when comprehension dawned in a child's eyes, felt like the most meaningful work she could imagine. The idea of dedicating her life to education no longer seemed like an impossible dream, but rather a natural extension of the healing and growth she had experienced. As the school day ended and the children departed for their various homes, Clara May found herself alone in the schoolhouse with Margaret. The older woman was grading papers at her desk, but she looked up as Clara May approached. "You were wonderful today," Margaret said with genuine warmth. "I've been teaching for 12 years, and I've rarely seen someone take to it so naturally. You have a gift for this work." The praise meant more to Clara May than Margaret could have known. To be recognized for her abilities rather than criticized for her shortcomings was still a novel experience, one that never failed to move her deeply. "I want to continue," Clara May said firmly. "If there's an opportunity for me to receive formal training, I'd like to pursue it." Margaret's face lit up with satisfaction. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already written to the Territorial Education Department about you. With your background and natural abilities, plus a strong recommendation from me, I believe you'd be accepted into their program." As they walked home together in the gathering dusk, Clara May reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had been forced to sleep with pigs was now planning to become a certified teacher, capable of shaping young minds and contributing meaningfully to society. That evening, the Mackenzie family gathered for dinner as they did every night. But tonight felt special, as Clara May shared news of her successful first day as a teacher and her plans for formal education. The pride and encouragement she received from every member of the family reinforced her sense of belonging and purpose. "You know," Sarah said as they cleared the dinner dishes, "when Thomas first told me about the situation in Nebraska, I hoped we might be able to help one young woman build a better life. I never imagined we'd be welcoming a future teacher into our family." The word family still had the power to bring tears to Clara May's eyes. After years of believing she was worthless and unwanted, she had found people who valued her not for what she could provide them, but for who she was as a person. As she prepared for bed that night, Clara May looked out her window at the mountains that surrounded the valley. Those majestic peaks had become symbols of the strength and permanence she had found in Colorado, reminders that some things in life were solid and enduring despite the storms that might rage around them. A letter from her mother waited on her nightstand, filled with news of Dorothy's continued recovery and expressions of pride in Clara May's accomplishments. Reading her mother's words, Clara May felt the last pieces of her broken heart beginning to heal. "My darling daughter," the letter concluded, "I know I failed you when you needed me most, but I'm so proud of the strong, capable woman you have become. Your father would be amazed to see how you've turned your suffering into a gift for others. I love you always." As Clara May settled into her comfortable bed, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of a household at rest, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the cowboy who had seen her worth when others saw only worthlessness. Thomas Mackenzie had given her more than rescue from an impossible situation. He had given her the chance to discover who she truly was beneath the layers of abuse and neglect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as she continued her journey toward becoming a certified teacher. But tonight, Clara May fell asleep knowing that she had found not just safety and security, but purpose and belonging in a world that had once seemed determined to crush her spirit. The girl who had been deemed worthless enough to sleep with pigs had become a young woman of value and promise, ready to dedicate her life to helping others discover their own worth and potential. It was a transformation that proved the truth Thomas had shown her from the beginning, that every person deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to become everything they're capable of being. In the end, Clara May's story became more than just a tale of rescue and redemption. It became proof that with courage, compassion, and the willingness to see value where others see only worthlessness, even the most broken lives can be transformed into stories of hope and triumph. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.